My mother did not come to my college graduation. She knew the date. She knew the time. She had the address of the venue written on a sticky note I mailed her 6 weeks before the ceremony. I remember pressing it into the envelope myself, wondering if she would actually show up or just say she meant to. She didn't show up, and she didn't say she meant to either. What she said when I called her that evening still wearing my gown because I hadn't been able to make myself take it off yet, was this: "Honestly, Tessa, I didn't think it was worth the drive." I stood in the parking lot of my apartment complex in the dark, and I didn't say anything for a long time. Not because I was crying. I wasn't. I had stopped expecting things from her years before that, or at least I thought I had. The silence was because I was calculating, running some internal math on how many times I had told myself this time will be different, and arriving at a number that embarrassed me. "Worth the drive," I finally said. "It's almost 3 hours, Tessa. I know how far it is. I've been living here for 4 years." She made a sound that I can only describe as a sigh dressed up as sympathy. And then she said, "You know your uncle's thing was this weekend too. We couldn't be in 2 places." I had not known about my uncle's thing. I didn't ask what the thing was. I told her I had to go, and I hung up and I sat on the curb between 2 parked cars and I looked at my hands for a while. Then I stood up, went inside, made myself a bowl of cereal because I hadn't eaten since 6 that morning, and I started figuring out what came next. I need to explain what I came from so that what comes later makes sense. My parents divorced when I was 9, not dramatically. No screaming, no police involvement, nothing that would make a good story. They just stopped pretending they liked each other, and my dad moved 40 minutes away to a 2-bedroom apartment, where I spent every other weekend until I was 16, and stopped going because the drives felt longer than they were, and neither of us knew what to say to each other once we got there. My mother remarried when I was 11. His name was Richard, and he had 2 kids from his first marriage, both older than me, both already mostly out of the house by the time he moved in. My mother thought this blended family thing would work. I think she wanted it to work so badly that she convinced herself it already had years before anyone else could see it. I was not cruel to Richard. I was not rude. I was also not included in much, and eventually I stopped waiting to be. I ate dinners, I did my homework, I stayed out of the way. My mother's attention moved in the direction of her new marriage, and then, 2 years later, in the direction of the pregnancy she hadn't planned but was thrilled about, and then in the direction of the baby, my half-sister, who was small and loud and needed everything my mother had. I don't resent my sister. I want to be clear about that. She was a baby. She didn't take anything from me. She just arrived at a time when there was already very little left. I graduated high school with a 3.8 GPA and a partial scholarship to a state university 4 hours away, which felt like exactly the right distance. I told my mother at dinner, and she said, "That's great, honey," and then went back to cutting my sister's food into small pieces. Richard said, "State school, huh?" in a tone I'm still not entirely sure how to categorize. I drove myself to move-in day with everything I owned in the back of a 2009 Honda Civic I'd bought with money from 3 years of weekend shifts at a grocery store. My mother sent a card. Inside, she had written "So proud of you," with an exclamation point that felt like it was working very hard. I spent the next 4 years working 2 jobs and studying. I interned twice. I graduated at 26, not 22, because I took 2 semesters off when the money situation got bad enough that the alternative was debt I couldn't calculate my way out of, and I used those semesters to work and save and come back with something underneath me. I graduated with a degree in accounting and a job offer already in hand from a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Chicago. I had negotiated the offer myself. I had researched the salary range, written out what I would say, and made the call from my apartment kitchen with a notepad in front of me. When they said yes to my counter, I sat down on the floor and cried for about 4 minutes, and then I got up and went to work because I had a closing shift. 2 weeks later, I drove 3 hours in my same Honda Civic to an auditorium where I shook hands with a dean I had never met, accepted a piece of paper that represented 4 of the hardest years of my life, and looked out at the crowd for a face I already knew wasn't there. Chicago was good to me. Not immediately. Nothing is immediately good when you move alone to a city where you know exactly 2 people, one of whom is a college acquaintance who turned out to have very different ideas about how often the dishes needed washing. I found a studio apartment in Pilsen that I could almost afford, took the L to work every morning, and learned the city block by block the way you do when you have no one to show you around and nowhere specific to be on weekends. The job was hard, and I was good at it. That combination turned out to be enough. I put in the hours, I asked questions when I didn't know something. And I did not let myself be intimidated by the people in the office who had gone to schools with better names, and seemed to have parents who had introduced them to half the firm at some cocktail party I hadn't been invited to because I didn't exist in that world. Within 2 years, I had a promotion. Within 3, I was managing a small team. At 29, I was brought in as a senior associate on a restructuring deal that went well enough that my name ended up in a trade publication in a paragraph about up-and-coming professionals in the region. I bought a real couch. I opened a Roth IRA. I sent my sister a birthday present for the first time in 3 years, because I finally had enough money left over at the end of the month to think about someone else. My mother called me on my birthday that October. We talked for 11 minutes. She asked how work was going, and I said fine, and she told me about a neighbor dispute involving a property line, and I listened and said the appropriate things. And when I hung up, I thought, this is what we are now, and I felt okay about it. I was not looking to fix anything. I had built something that was mine and it fit me, and I had stopped leaving space in it for people who had made clear they didn't need to be included. Which is why what happened next blindsided me as much as it did. My aunt, my mother's older sister, called me on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I hadn't spoken to her in probably 2 years. We had never been close in the way that I understood other people were close with aunts. She remembered my birthday approximately 60% of the time, and I remembered hers slightly less often. She said she was calling because the family thought it was time we all got together, that there were some things to discuss, that it had been too long. I asked what kinds of things. She said it was better discussed in person. She mentioned that my mother and Richard would be there, and my cousin Philip, who I had met maybe 4 times in my life. She said my grandmother's memory deserved to be honored properly, and that there was some talk of doing something meaningful with what was left of the estate. My grandmother on my mother's side had died 14 months earlier. She and I had been close when I was very young. She was the person who taught me to balance a checkbook, who told me that understanding money was the only kind of independence that couldn't be taken away. She had gotten sick slowly and then quickly, the way those things go. And by the time she was gone, I was deep enough in work that I hadn't been home in 8 months. I had guilt about that. Real guilt, not performed guilt. I carried it. I think that's why I said yes to the meeting. I drove 4 hours on a Saturday in April to my mother's house, which was the same house she and Richard had bought when I was in high school, where my old bedroom had been converted into a home office sometime during my sophomore year of college without anyone telling me. I sat in the driveway for 2 minutes before I went inside. My mother hugged me at the door. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn my entire life, and for a second, I felt 12 years old in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. She called me sweetheart. I could not remember the last time she had done that. The living room had 8 people in it. My aunt and her husband, Philip and his wife Stephanie, who I had never met. Richard, sitting in what was clearly his chair. My mother's cousin Thomas, who I recognized from old photographs and had not seen in person since my grandmother's funeral. There was a spread of food on the coffee table. Someone had made effort. That should have told me something. We ate first. This was strategy, I understand now. Let everyone get comfortable. Let me feel like this is a family gathering. Let the food create a kind of warmth that the actual relationships had not earned. Thomas started talking about my grandmother, about what she had meant to everyone, about the values she had tried to pass down. He is a good talker, smooth, measured, the kind of voice you want to believe, because it sounds like it doesn't need anything from you. I listened. I thought of my grandmother's kitchen, which smelled like coffee and dish soap, and the way she used to pull out a legal pad when she wanted to explain something important. Then my aunt set down her plate and said, "We've been talking about doing something in her name, a scholarship. Something that could help kids who are working their way through school." I said that sounded like a good idea. We were thinking of naming it after her, Philip said. The Family Foundation. And then, slowly, the way a cold comes on, I began to understand what I was sitting in. They wanted seed money, $100,000. From me. Because I was the one with the career, the one who had made something of herself, the one my grandmother would have wanted to honor her legacy. Thomas said this last part while looking at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sincerity. My mother said, "It would mean so much, Tessa, to all of us, to her memory." I set down my fork and I looked around the room. Here is what I knew in that moment. I had a good salary. I also had student loan debt I was still paying down, a retirement account I was trying to build seriously, and an emergency fund I had constructed, dollar by dollar from years of not buying things I wanted. $100,000 was not money I could simply produce. And even if I could, this was not how foundations worked. This was not a scholarship program. This was a family extracting money from the one member who had accumulated any. I said, "I'm not going to be able to do that." The room shifted. Not dramatically. No one raised a voice. But the warmth that the food had manufactured went somewhere else. My aunt said they hadn't expected me to do it alone, that everyone would contribute what they could, but that I was in the best position. I said I understood their thinking, and I still wasn't going to be able to contribute at that level. Philip said she would have wanted this. And I said, I think she would have wanted me to be financially stable, actually. She was pretty specific about that. We finished the meal in a way that could technically be called polite. I drove home that night with the windows down even though it was cold because I needed the air. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next 6 weeks, I received 12 phone calls between my mother, my aunt, and Thomas. Each one framed differently, sometimes emotional, sometimes logical, once almost threatening in tone, though never directly. Thomas sent me a 3-paragraph email that included the phrase, "the family's expectations," in a way that assumed I understood what that meant, and had agreed to it at some point I couldn't locate in my memory. I stopped answering the calls. I responded to the email once, briefly, saying I had given them my answer and it wasn't going to change. Then something else happened. My firm did background checks on new clients and ran periodic reputation assessments on senior staff. This was standard practice, part of our compliance framework. In late May, my manager called me into her office and closed the door. Someone had posted reviews on 2 professional networking sites claiming I had mismanaged client funds at a previous position. The reviews were specific enough to sound credible. They referenced dates and figures that were in the right range to seem plausible. They were completely fabricated. I knew this because the position they referenced did not exist. I had never worked at the company named. I had my employment records, my W-2s, my offer letters going back to my first job at 17, but the reviews were live. 2 clients had already flagged them to our business development team. 1 small contract was put on hold pending review. I sat in my car in the parking garage that evening and I thought about who had the motive and the specific knowledge to construct something like that. Who knew enough about my professional timeline to make it sound real without actually being verifiable? Who was angry enough or desperate enough to go there? I already knew. I hired an attorney. Her name was Anne, and she was exactly as expensive as I needed her to be and worth every dollar. I walked her through everything, the meeting, the calls, the email, the timeline of the false reviews. She listened without interruption and then asked me 4 questions that I could answer completely because I had kept everything, every voicemail saved, every email printed, the original 3-paragraph message from Thomas, time-stamped. Anne told me I had a strong defamation case and a plausible tortious interference claim given the contract that had been put on hold. She told me the first step was a cease and desist letter, which went out within the week. Thomas called me 4 hours after he received it. I did not answer. Anne's office handled all communication from that point forward. What I did not expect was what the investigation uncovered. In building the defamation case, Anne's team pulled public records and cross-referenced the financial information in my grandmother's estate, specifically the portions that had been discussed at the family meeting and the portions that had not. My grandmother had left a will. It had been filed. I had never asked to see it because I had not expected anything from it and had not wanted to seem like I was looking for something. What I found out, through Anne and through the probate records she obtained, was that my grandmother had left me a specific bequest, $46,000. Not a fortune, but significant and deliberate. She had updated her will 8 months before she died. I had never been told. The money had not been distributed correctly. It had been held in a shared account under my aunt's name, ostensibly for administrative purposes during the estate settlement period, A period that had now lasted 14 months with no distribution to me and no formal communication that I was owed anything. My aunt had been sitting in my mother's living room asking me for $100,000 while holding $46,000 that my grandmother had specifically set aside for me. When Anne laid this out for me in her office on a Wednesday morning, I sat very still for a long time. Not because I was shocked, I wasn't, entirely. Because I was doing the math on all of it. On the years. On the meeting. On the word sweetheart at the door. The legal process took almost 8 months. I am not going to walk through all of it because most of it was procedural and honestly tedious in the way that legal processes are when they are working correctly. Anne was methodical. The other side was not, which helped us considerably. The defamation claims were settled. Thomas issued a formal retraction through his attorney. The false reviews were removed. The contract that had been put on hold was reinstated. My manager had believed me from the beginning, but needed the formal resolution to move forward, which I respected. The estate matter was referred to the probate court. My aunt had not stolen the money outright. The technical situation was more complicated than that, but she had absolutely failed to notify me of the bequest, failed to initiate distribution, and had in the interim made decisions about the funds that she should not have been making. The court agreed. The full $46,000 plus interest, calculated from the date the estate was settled, was ordered distributed to me. My mother called me the night the estate judgment came through. I knew she had heard because my aunt had called her first. I could hear it in her voice when she said my name. She said she hadn't known about the bequest. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it matters. She said she was sorry about how things had gone. I said, I know. She asked if we could have a real conversation sometime. Get dinner maybe, when I was in town. I said I would think about it. And then, because I am who I am, and I learned it from a woman who used to pull out a legal pad when something needed to be understood clearly, I said, I need you to understand that I built everything I have without any help from this family. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because I think we've all been operating under a story that wasn't accurate, and I don't want to do that anymore. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I know, Tessa. I know that. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't quite enough. But it was the most honest thing she had said to me in years, and I decided to let it be what it was. I think about my grandmother more than I probably let on. About the legal pad. About what she understood that other people in that family chose not to. She knew what it cost to build something on your own. She'd done it herself, a generation earlier, under circumstances considerably harder than mine. She left me that money not because she owed it to me, but because she saw something in me she wanted to protect. I used $20,000 of it to pay off the last of my student loans. I put $20,000 into a brokerage account. The remaining $6,000 I held on to for a few months, and then I made a donation to a scholarship fund at my Alma State University, a real one, with a board and audited financials and an application process in my grandmother's name. No foundation meeting required, no family consensus. Just me, writing a check to something that would actually help someone, the way she would have wanted. The false reviews are gone. The contract is active. I got a raise in January that I negotiated the same way I negotiate everything, with research and a notepad and a number I had decided on before I walked into the room. My mother and I talk every few weeks now. It's different than it was. Not warm exactly, but honest. We say what we mean more than we used to. I think we both understand that we are not going to become a different kind of family, and there is something almost restful about having that be true out loud. I did not attend any more family gatherings. I have not spoken to my aunt or to Thomas since the legal process concluded. I don't feel the way I thought I would feel about that. Not relieved, not sad, just quiet. My sister is 15 now. She texts me sometimes. Memes, mostly. Last month, she sent me a question about how to open a savings account, and I spent 40 minutes on the phone walking her through it. I don't know what she was told about any of this. I hope not much. She has her own life to build, and she doesn't need the weight of it. I kept the graduation gown. It's in a box in my closet, folded badly the way you fold things when you're 26 and emotional and don't know you're gonna want to keep something. Sometimes I think about taking it out and finding out how to fold it properly. I haven't yet, but I will. I used to think the hardest part of what happened was the meeting, Sitting in that living room, watching Thomas work the room with that smooth, practiced voice while my mother passed around food like hospitality could undo years of absence. But looking back, the hardest part was the drive there. It was the 46 minutes I spent in my car in my mother's driveway, talking myself into going inside, because some part of me still wanted it to be different. Some part of me had never fully let go of the idea that family is supposed to mean something automatic, something that doesn't require proof. That part of me was wrong. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way that makes a good villain origin story. Just quietly, consistently wrong, the way a compass is wrong when it's been sitting too close to metal for too long. Here's what I have come to understand about cause and effect, not as a spiritual concept, but as a plain, observable fact. The things we do accumulate. They don't disappear because time passes, or because we reframe them, or because we set out a nice spread of food on a coffee table. Thomas sent those false reviews because he had spent years believing that outcomes should favor him without requiring the work. My aunt held that money in her account for 14 months because she had learned, somewhere along the way, that possession was easier than accountability. My mother called me sweetheart at the door because she needed something from me. And then, later, she said, "I know, Tessa. I know," because she had finally run out of the energy it takes to keep a false story going. None of those things happened in a vacuum. They were the logical ends of choices made across years. And the same is true of everything that went right. I had documentation because I am the kind of person who keeps documentation. I had a case because I had not actually done anything wrong. I had a job waiting for me after the reviews came down because I had built a reputation that could survive one bad month. The work I had done, the quiet, unglamorous, nobody is watching kind of work, turned out to be the only thing that actually protected me when something tried to take it apart. That's the part I want to hold on to, not the vindication. Though I won't pretend that didn't matter. It's the realization that integrity is structural. It holds weight. It doesn't require anyone else to witness it or confirm it or finally admit they were wrong about you. It just holds. And when something comes at it, it holds then too. I think about what my grandmother understood that the rest of them didn't. She watched me for years. She saw me drive myself to college in a car with 140,000 miles on it and come back 4 years later with a job offer I had negotiated myself. She updated her will 8 months before she died. She didn't make a speech about it. She just made a decision, quietly, in writing, and she trusted that I would figure out the rest. That is the version of love that actually helps someone. Not the kind that shows up with conditions attached and a seating chart for a meeting about your money. The kind that looks at a person honestly and says, "You are capable. Here is something to build on. I trust you to know what to do." I am 31 years old and I have a savings account, a clear conscience, and a text thread with my 15-year-old sister about how compound interest works. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything I ever wanted.